Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Sarah Gordon. Before we start, I just want to make note that this year has been generously sponsored by Joanna Bruce Goldstein to commemorate the first yard site of Biggie Bat Yosef, Frances Kashrovitsky Furman, who was the grandmother of Rachel Goldstein, who was class of 2011, and Davida Goldstein, who was the class of 2015. And hopefully the learning that we do here today should really serve as an aliyah for her neshama. Okay, so the title of today's shiur is Real Repentance, Sin, Power, and Corruption in the David Narratives. So I want to talk a little bit about David, and we'll tie into tshuva as well. Just to start off with a question, I think when we think of David as a model of tshuva, what's the first story that maybe comes to mind? David and Bathsheba, right. So we're actually not going to talk about that directly. I want to take kind of like a different approach, but we're going to see how it ties in a little bit at the end. I want to actually look at the story of David, Naval, and Abigail, which is an earlier story in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Kafeh. I want to do this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think that by looking through this narrative and through this story, we can see a lot of kind of characteristics or really character traits of David that on one hand are ones that make him a very strong king and ones that can be used to help him be a strong leader and be a strong king. But when left kind of unchecked or not channeled towards a positive outlet, can also lead to kind of his undoing. What I think we see in the story is that we're going to see a lot of hints kind of the sin that happens later on with David and Bathsheba. A lot of kind of things that happen in that story we're going to see have kind of underpinnings in this narrative as well. That kind of here with Naval, with Abigail, David kind of comes to the brink of certain averot, but he's kind of held back. We'll talk a little about how Abigail helps with that perhaps. And we see some of these character traits already kind of start to come out, but David's able to kind of keep them in check. While later on with David and Bathsheba, we'll see if this doesn't happen, unfortunately leads to his sin. And I think this is kind of an appropriate topic for this time period of the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, when we find ourselves in this time period where we're engaged in introspection, trying to be self-reflective, trying to think about our own character traits. Some of them that might lead to negative behavior, but ones that are, I think, very much a part of who we are and very much a part of our personality, and thinking about what are ways that we can be self-aware of these traits and how can we kind of channel them a little bit towards the good or towards more positive elements. So that's what I wanted to kind of look at today. Just to give a little bit of background before we start looking at the Psukim. So we're going to start off in Shmuel Aleph, Perek Kafeh. At this point, David has been running away from Shaul. Shaul feels very threatened by David. He wants to kill David. David's kind of in exile. He's running away. He has kind of a band of soldiers who are with him. He's helping out some of the different Jewish towns, helping to fight the Plishtim, but overall running away from Shaul. And what's interesting, we'll talk about this also, this Perek is kind of sandwiched between two stories or two interactions of David and Shaul. So in Chavdal, and two times where Shaul, and in Shaul and David's interaction, David actually has the potential to kill Shaul, but the last minute, decides, for moral or for ethical reasons, that he's not going to touch the Mashiach Hashem. He is not, Chalila, that he should take the life of the person who's still anointed by God as king. And in the previous parak in Chavdal, this happens in Ein Gedi, where Shaul comes to use the bathroom in a cave, and David and all his soldiers are there, and his soldiers are telling him, you should go, because this is your time. You can take Shaul out once and for all. And David says, Khalila, I'm not going to do it. Instead, he cuts his cloak. And then the story that happens right after this narrative, right after the story of Naval and Abigail, David also has an interaction with Shaul. Shaul comes with his army to try to take down David. David is, and a soldier kind of like go off and try to find where the soldiers are camped out. And Shaul is sleeping, and David goes, and again, he doesn't, and his soldier's like, you can go, you can take him out, I'll do it, I'll go kill Shaul right now. David's like, no, we're not going to kill him, this isn't how I operate. Instead, he just takes his kind of jug and his spear. And what's interesting is in both these stories, in both these interactions, David and Shaul have this kind of face-off where David basically says, why do you keep trying to do this? Why are you coming to kill me? Don't you see that I could have killed you, in this time, and I didn't? This isn't what I'm about. I'm not here to take someone's life. This isn't what I'm going to do. And they have that and in both times, Shaul kind of apologizes. So that's just kind of like the framework, the background a little bit for this story, just to set it up for us. So now I guess we'll look at the story. I gave you the GPS. We have the Hebrew and also the English. Anyone wants to follow along in English as well. We're going to look through this story, and we'll have a chance to kind of see again, as we read through it, see exactly what's going on with David, Naval, and Abigail. And what I want us to think about as the readers is do we see any kind of hints in this story or any similarities to what happens later on with David and Bathsheba? So that's basically the plan for now. Okay, so if you look on, it's around the back, Parak Hey, where it starts. We'll read through certain parts. We'll read together, and other parts we'll just summarize. The parak starts off, Parak Hey Pasuk Aleph, telling us, "Vayimat Shmuel v'kritzu kol Yisrael v'sedu lo v'kavru b'veit b'Ramah v'yikam David v'yared el midbar Paran." It's interesting that the first thing we're told before this whole story of Naval and Abigail and David is that Shmuel died. So why exactly is that important to tell us right now that Shmuel died? So the Mefarshim give many different types of explanations, different interpretations. One idea, we'll look at a source second. Actually, before, I just want to mention that most of the ideas I'm going to share today are not my own. I gave kind of like for further reading kind of at the end. A lot of this is based on different ideas of Rabbi Chaim Angel. He's a Bible professor at Yeshiva University. There's lots of really interesting articles about this parak and kind of the literary significance of it. Shmuel Hertzfeld also has an article in a publication by Yeshiva Chovei Torah, so I also took some ideas from that. And also from Amnon Bazak, from Yeshiva Har Tzion, also has a book on Shmuel, which is an excellent book, and he also kind of talks about this. So a lot of these ideas are kind of taken from a lot of those different sources. So again, with that disclaimer, going back to the beginning of our parak, why start off with the death of Shmuel? So different ideas that are brought. One interesting kind of literary idea, and I think I brought the source as source number 4, Rabbi Joseph Kara explains that when the Navi dies, or kind of if the Navi had been alive, and what we're going to see in the story is kind of David's has a little bit of an overreaction, or David's kind of, his anger and how exactly he reacts in this way to Naval. If Shmuel had been alive, David would have been much more restrained, right? Malanu laskir kan mitato shel Shmuel, elodia ilu haya Shmuel kayam, lo haya David omer lamata min ha'inyan im notar Naval ad or boker mashtin bekir, lefi shaya mityarem Shmuel. So interesting kind of already, I think, just to give us kind of this context that David kind of already kind of doesn't have like his, the Navi, his mentor is not there, and this idea that kind of when the Navi is not around, everyone's behavior is a little bit more kind of unchecked, which is interesting. It's kind of like if you have a day, we have it sometimes in my note, like half the teachers are on a conference, there's a little bit of a different feel in the building, a little bit how everyone's running around, but here, right, Lahavdil, like a little bit different, but this idea that, again, perhaps already to give us an insight into David's behavior, but there's a little bit kind of like less restraint. Another kind of approach that I think will help us kind of set a theme throughout this parak is that Shmuel is really the key to David's legitimacy as the next king. As we know, right, Shmuel was the one who anoints David, who tells him that he's going to be the next king, that God has rejected Shaul, and David is going to be the one to take over. But what's the problem with that ceremony when Shmuel kind of anoints David? It's a private ceremony. People don't know about it, right? With Shaul, at least, that was a very public ceremony. Here, Shmuel is really the key to David's legitimacy. And what's interesting here, Rabbi Chaim Angel talks about this a little bit, that, the people, the Jewish people probably love David. He's, with his militia, he's helping them out. He's fighting the Plishtim. He's a national war hero, right, who saved them from Goliath. But again, when it comes, and again, he's married to Michal, so, he's in the family, right, the next one up to be, the legitimate king. But still, this idea of kind of like David being chosen by God as the next king isn't something that's really so public. Different Mefarshim talk about, well, in the last parak, Shaul acknowledges it, so maybe that gives a little more credence. But again, I think this idea of almost like, if we think putting ourselves in David's head for a second, this idea of Shmuel just dying and that really being the person who could have gotten up and really given David kind of this legitimacy to being the next king or to the throne, and kind of like that legitimacy now, again, whether this could be in reality or this could be David projecting it, is kind of like been taken away a little bit. So again, just to give us kind of like that intro to the parak. So that kind of starts off our story with Shmuel's death, and then it sets a stage of what is happening with Naval. So we'll skip to Pasuk Bet. We have his first in Naval, V'ish v'ma'on u'maseir be'karmel, V'ish gadol me'od, v'lotzon shloshet alafim, ve'elef izim, v'hi b'gzos etzono be'karmel. So we have this person who's really, really rich in Carmel. He has lots of sheep, and he's having a sheep shearing festival. The pasuk continues. Now it gives us a little bit of context about this couple, Naval and Abigail. V'shem ha'ish Naval, v'shem ishto Abigail, v'ha'isha tovat sechel, v'yefat toar, v'ish kasher v'ram alalim v'hu kalvi. What's interesting here is usually like already kind of the biblical narrator is stepping in to kind of give us a little bit of telling us even just about the character of Naval, or calling him like an evil person instead of kind of like letting his actions kind of speak for it. But even if you think about the sense of the name, right? Naval means what? Or Naval is like, right, someone like disgusting, right? So here you have someone like his name is disgusting. And later on when Abigail is kind of ratting him out to David, she even uses that, instead like, oh, like he's just like his name, right? So already we have kind of like the narrator stepping in. Here we have Naval, an evil person, right? His name is Naval, his name is disgusting. And it says over here, Behu Kalbi, which the pshat means that he is descended from Kalev. It's interesting, the Ralbag actually says, no, it's not just that he's descended, right, from Kalev, but it's a literary thing also, to try to get this idea of Kelev. So like his name is basically disgusting dog guy, basically. That's like the context of how the Tanakh kind of introduces him to us, and giving us already, telling us like he's an evil person. And foil, right, Abigail is beautiful, she's wise, and we'll hear more about her later. So that's kind of like setting up the scene for us. So what happens? So now we're going to see David has a request. So I'm going to read through these psukim. I want us to think about the legitimacy of David's request and also the language that he's using. So Vayishma David v'midbar ki gozez naval tzono. So he hears about this, and he's going to send. We'll skip down to pasuk vav. So he sends a bunch of his na'arim to go and talk to Naval, which should read the end of pasuk vav. Yishaltem lo b'shmila shalom. We're going to ask him, for saying his name. Go greet him. V'martem. Ko alechi v'ata shalom u'beitcha shalom v'kol asher lecha shalom v'ata shamati ki gozim lecha ata haroim asher lecha hayu imanu lo hiklunu v'lo nifkad lahem me'uma kol yemai hayotzim bekarmel shal narecha v'yigidu la v'yimtzu anarim chen beinecha yahayom tov banu tnana et asher timsa yarecha lavadecha u'vincha u'david. Basically, what had been going on was David's soldiers had been guarding Naval's shepherds throughout the, shepherding time or season. Unclear whether they were hired. It seems a little bit, I guess it's like the mafia protection. We'll come and we were helping you out. There was no crime in the streets, so now you have to pay up. And now, Naval's a very rich guy having this very big party, and listen, can you give us some of your food? Basically coming asking for some food. But again, this language of, right, what seems to be the tone here at David's language, David's request? You owe me, right? He's coming and saying, right, like you could even double check, right? We never harmed you. We made sure you were protected. So on one end, kind of he's coming, and demanding what he feels he's justifiably owed, whether or not, right, that this was like a contract. It seems like he just, volunteered his services, but he definitely feels like he was owed that. Which is also some of the words that he uses, is like, I would say also it's very differential. He's still demanding like almost like a payoff or this payment, but this idea of he calls himself at the end like la'avdecha u'lebincha, to your servant, your son David. He's asking him l'shalom, right? He's coming and it seems like he's asking for wages that he's owed. So we'll come back and just interesting. We'll come back to that in a second. Does this remind us of anything else in Tanakh where someone comes and there's like a controversy over wages? Something a little bit with sheep. Yes, very good. So Yaakov and Lavan, a lot of different Rav Azad Kasvadas and a few other modern scholars that like this really sounds like Yaakov and Lavan. And this idea where David here is kind of Yaakov coming and asking from, the trickster Lavan for his payment. So interesting, but again, it does seem like, David also is, asking for what he's worth. But again, it's definitely seems to be this parallel, not to be in bad, it's not bad company to be compared to Yaakov. We'll come back, as we'll see later, David kind of switches to similarity with different Tanakh character. Okay, so that's the request that's made. What happens? Pasuk Tet, they come and they make that request. And listen to Naval's response in Pasuk Yud. Vayan Naval et avdei David vayomer. Mi David umi ben Yishai hayom rabu ha'avadim hamipartzim ish mifnei Adonav. Right? Who is David? Who is this Ben Yishai? Like, there's lots of slaves these days that are just running away from their masters. Then he goes on, Pasuk Yud Aleph, V'lakati lachmi ve'et meimai ve'et tavachti asher tavachti l'gozai v'natati l'anashim asher lo yadati emi zehema. I'm going to give all my hard-worked food to this, like, nobody? I don't know who this guy is. It's not happening. And basically, and we'll unpack the statement in a second, just to kind of keep going. So Pasuk Yud Bet. David's, servants, the Narim or the soldiers come back. They tell him what happened. David's reaction, Pasuk Yud Gimel, V'yomer David lanashav, Chigru ish et charbo, V'chagru ish et charbo, V'chor gam David et charbo, V'yalu acharei David ba'arba ma'od ish, u'matayim mishvol kelim. David's reaction is, we're not gonna take this. Like, everyone get your swords, like, gear up. We're gonna leave some guys back to guard the stuff, and we and these 400 people are going off to war. And later on, when he's talked down by Abigail, he basically tells Abigail also his plan was to not leave, like, he wasn't gonna leave any men alive. So let's unpack a little bit of what we've read together. Thoughts about Naval's reaction, right? Oh, there's lots of slaves these days running away from his master. Who is David? Who is Ben Ishai? What do we think about, I want to talk about David's reaction, but first, what do we think about Naval's reaction here? What's kind of prompting it? Is this justified? Where is this coming from? Like, this kind of like, who is David? Who is this Ben Ishai? Any thoughts or?
Arrogant.
Okay.
Because, he thinks that he's bigger than this. Maybe he didn't realize that David was the future king, but maybe he did. And he certainly knew that he was a prince.
Okay, good, right? So it seems like, we'll get to this, right? Almost like, David's going to be the future king of Israel, or, if you treat him with some respect. Like, this isn't some way to talk to someone, who has, like, a lot of power. And we'll see later on, like, maybe at this point, and maybe he doesn't. Maybe that's why he feels he can get away with it. Yeah.
He also frames him as someone who's rebelled against the rightful king.
Right, exactly. And I think this is like, right, this idea of like slaves running away from their masters, right? It's almost like I think a dig at David. If we think about it, as we said, at this point, David has run away from Shaul. Like, he knows that he's going to be the next king. But Shmuel has died, right? The Navi who like brings him legitimacy. And at this point, you really have a situation where there definitely were pro-Shaul factions. There were a lot of murmurings. Like, who is this David? Like, if he wants to, sit and just be married to Michal and wait out, natural death, then, like, I guess he and Yonatan could figure it out, which we see that, Yonatan even offers him to take the throne. But, like, what is this? What are these murmurings? Like, no, like, Shaul is the king now. So there definitely were these, murmurings against David. And I think and David definitely was aware of them. And to hear this from this, like, Naval, this like, guy who's being so arrogant, saying, like, what? I'm not helping you. Like, who are you? Like, you runaway slave, like, rebel against Shaul. What's interesting, Bazak actually talks about, like, some people will try to say, like, oh, maybe, Naval was a supporter of Shaul. So Bazak says, like, it's probably unlikely because we know he descends from Kalev, which is part of Sheva Yehuda. So, like, he probably would have been, it would have been strange for someone like from Sheva Yehuda to have, ties or loyalties towards Shaul. But it definitely is kind of like jumping on this kind of like, political slogan of the day. Like, even if you don't have, like, loyalty towards Shaul, you definitely don't have to be a fan of David, which that definitely is coming from. We see a little bit of his miserness, all right? Again, like, afterwards, like, I don't want to give you my stuff, like, this is mine, like, nope. I think the main thing here David is hearing is, it sounds like a very much like a dig at him for rebelling a little bit against Shaul. David's reaction, getting 400 men, an army, right? They're coming and attacking. Thoughts about that? Yeah.
But he's also a self-made man. I mean, he's earned what he's earned, and there's no obligation that he has to David, period. So there's no reason why he shouldn't protect himself from a general who just comes in whatsoever. So whether we consider him evil or not, which we can, that still doesn't change whether it's right or not that David, what he's doing, and that he shouldn't be protective of everything he's done.
For sure, right? It can read like extortion, and like, Naval has everything that he had, right? Exactly. And like, and who is David to come and demand? Like, he's not king, right? So
He could have been inherited his wealth. I mean, he could have just grown up that way.
Either way, it's still, whether he inherited, there's nothing to suggest that he inherited in any nefarious way,
right,
or that he earned it his way. But either way, it's his possessions, it's his property, and somebody is coming in offering protection.
Right. So I think what's interesting here is that, again, whether Naval is a good, is like a jerk or not, or depending how you want to read it, or even the legitimacy of David's request, David's reaction, I think we can say, like, seems to be a little bit unjustified. Like, even if you, are upset or you're insulted, to all of a sudden decide that you now have the authority to go and wipe out the entire kind of family of Naval seems a little bit as an overreaction. It seems I think these are questions I want us to engage with, and we'll look at some different ideas that some modern scholars have, and also we'll look at the Gemara. Chazal have an interesting read as well. But first of all, kind of like, where's this overreaction coming from? Especially if you think about the context, right? And we'll talk about why this is important. Like the previous parak, right? He could have killed Shaul, but David's all like, no, very deferential. I'm not going to be someone who like takes people's lives. But now he gets insulted and like, bam, like gear up, everyone, we're going in, right? Like where does this kind of like almost like 360 turn come from? And also this idea Again, kind of like where's David's kind of like these character traits? Where are they coming from? And even just, it seems a little bit unjustified. Like even if Val, is like not the best guy, like does it really kind of like warrant this type of response? So we'll come back to these questions. Yeah.
Considering the size, at first it sounds like David's request is fairly small. He sends Narim. It's me and a few of my friends who are in the hills here. Can we stop by? Can we stop in for a meal?
Right. So
And it
Naval.
turns out a few of his friends are 600 warriors.
Right. That's true. It would have been a lot of like the harvest. I mean, he's asking for like a cut, basically, which would have been a significant amount, for sure.
But if you start doing that regularly, it eats into a flock of 3,000 sheep pretty quickly.
Right. I guess one way to see it though is like, especially like the parak before, I think the beginning of maybe it's Chavdal Chav Gimel, where like David like saves the town of Keilah from the Plishtim. It's almost like David's like this like his militia is like helping the local population. I guess like he doesn't have any forms of income. I'm not justifying it, but like like it could like you're right. Like it's asking a lot for 600 men, but maybe David feels like he doesn't have a choice. Right. That like he needs like the local people to be supporting him, or it's not gonna. Yeah.
I also don't get the timeline necessarily in terms of the amount of time that David might have been involved protecting them, because it sounds to me like Shmuel died, and the very first thing David does is he goes to Naval and he asks for this.
Right.
Had he been protecting them for a significant period of time by now or not? Because has there been any mention of that prior to Chafhei?
Right.
Of any connection with him protecting anybody?
Well, he definitely does save different towns, but it's more kind of like towns are being raided by the Plishtim. David takes the initiative to go and protect those towns. But then it doesn't say after that David goes and like asks for he usually takes the spoils and the But
so then, from Naval's perspective, he's not seen anything that they're claiming to have done either.
No, that's a good point.
He hasn't ever seen that. So.
Right. So these are good points. I want to kind of move on. I want us to look at kind of we want to be interactive. I want to look at Abigail's kind of reaction, and then kind of we're going to try to bring it all together and see kind of different approaches. Okay, so what happens next? We're going to summarize a little bit of the next part just outside. One of Naval's kind of Arim comes to Abigail, and he's like, "You won't believe like what your husband did now. Like, he was insulted David. Now David's he's coming with all these men. We have to figure out what to do." So skip down to pasuk Yichet. V'temaher Abigail v'tikach 200 lechem u'shnayim nivlei yayin v'chamesh tzon asuyot v'chamesh se'im kali u'mea tzimukim u'matayim dvelim v'teshem al-chamarim. Lots and lots of food. Puts it on donkeys. V'tamar l'na'area ivru l'panai hineni achareihem ba'ali isha. Uli isha naval lo higida. So a couple things interesting is, first of all, she sends it's basically a giant tribute to David. She sends it ahead of her, like it should go ahead with some messengers, and she's going behind her husband's back. She does not tell him. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then she goes, to summarize the next part's kind of outside, like she goes on the donkey, she sees David. It says, it's interesting, in Pasuk Chavalab, David had been saying, why was he kind of so annoyed? We get a little bit of sense of the voice in his head. ודוד אמר, אך לשקר שמרתי את כל אשר לזה במדבר ולא נפקד מכל אשר לא מהומה. Like, why did I even bother helping this guy? וישב לי רעה תחת טובה. And he paid me back רעה instead of tova. And we'll come back to that. We'll see that line actually comes up in some other stories as well. Skip over actually the next page. We see a little bit, why David is so annoyed. He says, I'm not going to leave not even one male alive. Pasuk Chav Gimel. So now the tribute has passed. Abigail is following it. She meets David. She gets down from the donkey. Vatzipol la'apei David al panev tishakavu aretz. And she bows down to David. And she keeps going. And she's really pleased before him. Vatzidaber na matacha baznecha shema divrei matacha. Please listen to your maidservant. And just to summarize the next part, she said, my husband is like, don't worry about, he's like this Naval. He's this like, disgusting person. Like he always acts this way. And then she goes on this very, very long speech for the next 5 or 6 psukim. Now, some of the main themes in this speech. First of all, she's extremely deferential. She keeps calling herself like David's servant. And she keeps actually also, which is important, she keeps kind of saying, that you're going to become king one day. I know, my master is going to become king one day. And the main theme seems to be, number 1, that David is going to become king one day. And number 2, don't let your kingdom be stained by an act of violence now. Like, don't come and step in now and kill Naval. This isn't what you do. You don't come and you don't want your future kingdom, when you become king, to be stained with this idea of blood. I think it's interesting here because she's, playing, I think, said David feels very insulted. So she's saying, I know you're going to be king. Like, Naval's like a nobody. Don't worry about him. And really this kind of like playing, this kind of like, mentioning to him, you don't want your kingdom to be stained with blood. I'll just point out a couple of interesting psukim, right, like in Pasuk Chafal, Bata, Adoni Chai Hashem v'chai nafshech, asher mancha Hashem mivo b'damim. Like God has, prevented you usually from taking vengeance on your enemies with blood, but Ashir yadecha lach, and God always comes and saves you instead. V'ata yiyu kenaval oivecha v'mekshim el Adoni ra'ah. V'ata habracha azot asher hevi shivtech la'Adoni v'itna l'na'arim v'tachim b'reglei Adoni. And I've given you this tribute. Just take the stuff. We'll skip ahead a little bit more. Here we go. And in Pasuk Lamed. I know that one day you're going to be, God's going to make you king over Israel. Pasuk Lamed Aleph. Don't let this be a stumbling block that you're now going to spill innocent blood. So this major theme of, you're going to be king, and don't let you're not. This isn't what you do, David. Like this isn't. You don't take people's lives out of vengeance. Like this is not the type of kingdom you want. When you become king, you don't want people to be able to say you started off with this act of vengeance. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. And she throws in at the end. And also, when you become king, and also remember your maidservant, which we'll see the Gemara and Midrashim see it as almost her saying, and later on, like if anything happens to my husband, almost like telling David like she would be interested in marrying him, like come back and marry me. It's similar language is used in Megillah Ruth also, just to remember the handmaiden. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But again, like her major speech to David, and the response seems to be, David says in Pasuk Lamed Bet, Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael that sent you, and he says, okay, now I'm not gonna, you stopped me from like spilling blood, and if you hadn't stopped me, I would have killed out everyone. So it's really good you came. Go home safely. The end of the story, some of us might be familiar with it. She goes home. She tells Naval everything that happened. What happens to Naval? He dies. He's like, what? Like, you gave away my stuff? And he has, his heart turned to stone, and he falls ill, and 10 days later he dies. Fast forward a little bit later, and what happens to Abigail? She marries David, right? And they all live kind of, happily ever after. And that's a little bit the end of kind of this arc of this narrative. So I want to unpack a few of these things and try to bring it together in the time that we have left. So it's interesting, at the beginning, we said that David and Naval seemed very similar to Lavan and Yaakov, with David playing kind of the role of Yaakov. However, in his whole interaction with Abigail and his waging war on Naval, what other kind of story in Tanakh does it sound like? 400 men and sending a tribute ahead, and then there's bowing. Yeah, right? So it sounds very much the story of Yaakov and Esav, right? But here, right, David is who? He's switched from being Yaakov. He's Esav, right? And Abigail sending the tribute ahead, right, when Yaakov is scared of that Esav is coming with 400 men and sending the things ahead and bowing down. And, Abigail's playing the role of Yaakov. So I think it's actually, like in a literary perspective, like criticism of David, you've gone from being the Yaakov to now you're acting like Esav. And again, right, we see Abigail was able to talk him down, but I think the question, and for this I want to, try to take a few different approaches, going back to this original question of, what is motivating David's overreaction? What is the message kind of this story? And we'll see also how it ties into this time period of the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. And we also had that hanging question also of the whole concept of David and Bathsheba. Do we see any kind of character traits of David here that will come to haunt him a little bit later on? And we'll come to that as well. So what I wanted to see from this, I want to kind of take 4 major points. I think 4 major takeaways that we can look at in kind of analyzing David, and we can discuss these together. So the first one, I think, is going back to the idea that this story of David, Naval, and Abigail is sandwiched between those 2 stories, those 2 interactions that David has with Shaul. I gave you a little bit of give some charts here. So this is basically the first chart, right, that just kidding. This is chart number, maybe this one, sorry, I think at the end I actually didn't put this one on it. But this idea that, right, in the first parak, in Chavdalad, right, David has the opportunity to wipe out, to kill Shaul, and he doesn't, right? And then we have this whole story of Naval and Abigail, and then the next parak, right, in Chavav, he has the opportunity to kill Shaul, and he doesn't. So a lot of different scholars kind of see it. This isn't kind of accidental. This is all kind of like one literary unit that we have here. And really what Abigail is saying in her speech to David is she's basically referencing that previous parak, that previous incident where David has a chance to kill Shaul and doesn't. I think it's a nice kind of message of, of this idea of Aseret Yemei Tshuva, we're trying to be the best people we could be. And I think Abigail's main argument, one could read it as saying, David, this isn't what you're about. Like, you don't take vengeance on people. You're the exact opposite. Like, we just saw, again, she probably wasn't there, but this idea, at least for us, the reader, right? Like, the last scene where we saw you, you're even more justified. I would say, Shaul is like, chasing after you, trying to kill you. He's not giving up. Like, you definitely, everyone, all your soldiers are like, just kill him right now. And you're like, no, Halila, I'm not going to touch Mashiach Hashem. My kingdom is not going to be a coup. Like, I will take over as king when Shaul dies of old age, or, right, he ends up dying in battle, but I'm not going to be the one, it's not a coup. I'm not going to start my kingdom in bloodshed. And she's like, that's what you're going to be doing now. And she's able, I think, to talk him down from acting this way by referencing, like, this is not who you are, David, this is not what your kingdom is going to be about. I think it's kind of like an interesting, like, juxtaposition. And it's interesting, later I heard, this past summer, I was in Israel, I learned a little bit at Matan, and there's someone who spoke there, Rabbi David Sabato, and he gave an interesting kind of idea also. He said the reason why you have the next story afterwards of almost seems like a very similar narrative, right, of like David and Shaul, and he could kill Shaul and he doesn't, is almost like the cycle of David doing tshuva. That like David kind of like, is very moral in Perek Chavdal. He doesn't kill Shaul. He refrains from killing Shaul. Then in Kav Hey, right, that kind of like, gets undone because he had this whole potential to like kill Naval. Abigail talks him down, and then we need another interaction with Shaul to show David has internalized Abigail's words and that that he doesn't take people's lives and he's not gonna have his kingdom be one that's kind of like founded in blood. So that's kind of like an interesting idea. Also, this idea of like David being reminded, trying to be the best possible person that he could be. The second point, I think, is that we see in this parak a lot of kind of hints to the story of David and Bathsheba. So this is a chart, I think, that I did leave in. This is the first chart. So this is a lot of different scholars talk about this, a lot of different articles that I read when I was looking into this, that first of all, you have a lot of similar words between the two stories, whether it be the theme of shalom, right, asking for shalom, with David and Bathsheba and David and Naval, the idea of like sending his servants to go and ask for shalom of how Naval is doing, and also David trying to figure out how the nation's doing in war. The idea of seter, things that are happening secretly, whether it be, here Abigail is kind of going behind her husband's back, right, to kind of set all this up, and a lot of kind of secret plots that are going on, right, with David and Bathsheba, especially when he's trying to, once Bathsheba's pregnant, and David is trying to almost, cover it up and figure out what's going to happen with Uriah, and like the secret, idea of like Uriah being sent out to battle, where he's actually, he's holding in his hands like his own, like death warrant to basically give to Yoav. So again, these themes of secrecy, themes of the Cherav, again, like drinking, right? David tries to get Uriah drunk, and Uriah gets drunk, but he still refuses to go home. And Naval also, we see later on, is very drunk when Abigail comes back. Theme of messengers also in both texts. But I think the most kind of striking parallels is we have kind of like the same kind of themes here of both potential for murder and potential for adultery. And even if it seems like a little bit of a stretch, the potential for adultery, we'll see this is actually the read Chazal has in the Gemara in Megillah on Daf Yudal, which we'll get to in a second. But really, in both of these, you have this opportunity really where like a married man is kind of betrayed. Either Abigail is betraying Naval, or David is betraying Uriah by sleeping with Bathsheba. You have some sort of an interest in a married woman that's going on, right? Like overtly with Bathsheba, and unclear what's happening exactly with Abigail. And it seems also like this attempted murder, the justification of which seems to be this theme of mored b'malchut, which is used kind of like the Gemara quotes this in a number of places, mored b'malchut, that if you cannot rebel against the king, if you're a rebel against the king, you deserve to die. And it seems that a little bit in this story, not just the potential for those sins, but that David almost has this, the reason why he has this overreaction is because he sees Naval as being a mored b'malchut. He's the king, right? I think people mentioned this, we unpacked this before, that you can't respond to the king this way, and refuse to give him things. The only problem is, what is David's role at this moment? He is not king, right? Yet he seems to feel like he can act that way. And what's interesting here, if you look at the last, almost one of the last sources, source number 8, the Gemara in Megillah has kind of like a fascinating definitely not the pshat read, but a fascinating read of the conversation between David and Abigail. And it basically sets up the scene where it has, Abigail bringing a question on Hilchot Nida to David to paskin, and he doesn't want to paskin it. And he's like, we don't paskin, maro, like at night. And so she responds to him like, it's underlined parts of her, Amar lo, mored b'malchut. Oh, sorry. A little bit earlier. Amar lo, v'kidanin dinin nefashot b'layla. So too, do we judge issues of dinin nefashot, of capital crimes at night? Meaning, like, who are you now to say that Naval deserves to die? But Amar la mored b'malchutu, v'lo tzarich l'maydanehu. No, he's mored b'malchut, so I can make exceptions, and I'm allowed to go and kill him, using this very kingly justification for what he's going to do to Naval. Amar lo, adayin Shaul kayam, v'lo yatsa tivech ba'olam. Like, well, Shaul, last time I checked, Shaul is still king, and you're not in charge yet. You can't go around, trying to execute people because they're mored b'malchut. Amar la, ubaruch tamech ubrucha at asher kaltani hayom hazeh mevo b'dami. Then he reads back in this pasuk that David's like, you know what, you're right, and saying here almost that she's been able to kind of talk David off that ledge. That you're not king yet, so don't act like one. But it's interesting that the Gemara kind of reads a lot more into us, and it says, wait a second, David said the word, you stopped me from damim, which is plural. Damim tarte mashma. What's the second blood that you prevented him from doing? Elam elamed shegilta shokav alech lo'orat shalosh parsaot. Amar hishmi'eni li, Amar lo tiyezot lecha lefuka. So basically, then it kind of reads into this almost that Abigail was trying to seduce David, and there was kind of some semblance here of like a potential for adultery. And David says, hishmi'eli, listen to me, which different commentators in the Gemara say means like he actually asked her to sleep with him. But Amar lo, and she says, no, don't let this. Again, reading it back to the pasuk, don't let this be a stumbling block for you. Then interesting, the Gemara, reads into that. Don't let this, right? Lo tiyeh zot lecha lefuka. Zot miklal deika acharite. This was not a stumbling block, meaning David does not engage in murder and adultery in a story with Naval and Abigail. But where will he engage in the sin of adultery and murder? In a story of David and Bathsheba, right? Umaynihu maseh de Bathsheba umaskana hachi have, and that's exactly what happened. Then it goes on a little bit more. Summers actually, we'll come back to that part a little later. But I think what's interesting here is by seeing the parallel to David and Bathsheba in this story, and Rabbi Angel talks about this a lot, I think that there's really this idea that David has all these characteristics that can definitely do lead to negative outcomes and corruption of power and murder and adultery later on. But they're also the same spin of character traits that allow you to become king. Meaning, if someone's going to be king, you have to be ambitious. You have to be someone who knows what they want. You have to be someone who almost craves a little bit of that power, but hopefully uses all of that for good. But here we have David. Number one, he's acting like a king that he's not, and Abigail is able to kind of help him check, I think, those character traits that can, lead him to a lot of the pitfalls, unfortunately, we see many of our leaders, fall into, and is able to kind of talk David down and keep that in check. But unfortunately, he's not able to keep that in check long term. And actually, ironically, when he is king, when he finally does become king, these are when these sins occur. Which I think is interesting also, right? So we think about this time of tshuva and real self-reflection. Sometimes we need other people, to kind of point things out to us. But how do we? I listened to Dr. Osher Cohen, her previous shir about, psychology of tshuva, and she was talking about the importance of maintenance, right? How do we kind of maintain, our when we're working on ourselves, how do we maintain the good behavior? So here too, right? David's able to get talked down by Abigail, but it's not really kind of maintained, which I think is kind of an interesting approach as well. And the last few things, I think, as we wrap up, and then I'm happy to open up to questions and discussions, the last thing which I think is interesting to look at is the second last thing we'll talk about, Naval and Shaul. There's a lot of kind of interesting parallels between Naval and Shaul. And this I think I gave you, sorry, the source is a little bit all over the place, but chart number 3, similarities between Naval and Shaul. It's interesting that David uses the language of Meshalem Ra'at Tova, not exactly the direct quote, but this idea that I've only done good for you, and why are you returning bad things, when he talks to Naval. But it actually sounds like something that he said, kind of a paraphrase of what he said to Shaul in the previous parak. Like, why are you always chasing me? Like, I just want to help you. I just want to be a good soldier, and why are you doing all these terrible things to me? We see a lot of parallels that the family members of both Naval and Shaul are more loyal to David than they are to Shaul and Naval, right? Whether it's Yonatan and Michal, or whether it's Abigail or the Na'arim. And we also see this idea of Naval acting like a king. There's a very interesting approach just brought by Professor Moshe Garciel, who's a professor at at Bar Ilan, and he actually says, which is interesting, that David kind of psychologically or subconsciously somehow is viewing Naval as Shaul. And he has this whole kind of idea that basically David kind of like in the previous parak is like repressing all of his like anger against Shaul, right, and being very deferential. I'm not going to kill Mashiach Hashem. But then when someone starts saying Shaul-like things to him, like look at all these slaves running away from their master, what happens to David? He like explodes basically, because he's not like he's hearing when he sees Naval talking in his mind, he's hearing Shaul, and like this is someone who he actually can go and like fight against. So almost this idea of, I think also is interesting, right? Like thinking about ourselves and our own kind of ways of working on ourselves. Like what are our triggers? Like what are things that kind of like why sometimes do we have such negative, or such angry reactions to different things? I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but sometimes like if you stop and you think about why you reacted a certain way, it's usually because like it wasn't just what happened on the surface. There was something there that was triggering something else. So I thought it was very interesting here, almost with David, to see how he like sees this trigger kind of almost like from Naval. And he like, it's almost like, oh, like what? You're going to say a Shaul thing like that to me? And then he like, really has this very, very intense reaction. And the final thing, which I think is interesting, and we'll bring this together, that David almost starts to become Shaul. And I think it's something that we can see with a few different parallels, that David here, right, this idea of like taking vengeance on, even as we said, Naval, his name is like, disgusting, and he doesn't seem to be the nicest person. I think, as someone has mentioned, right, it makes sense for Naval also a little bit to say, like, I don't want to give you things, David, like, I don't want to help all your men. Why? And so David is like taking revenge on someone who like it's not really justified, and that's exactly what was happening earlier when like Shaul is like chasing David to like take him down. And I think it's interesting also, right, psychologically almost to see like it's like David is almost becoming his like worst nightmare. Like the whole time, like he's been, yelling at Shaul for like what you're doing and how you're chasing me and I don't deserve this. And now, like he's almost becoming Shaul, chasing, wanting to take vengeance on someone who doesn't deserve it. Another interesting parallel, also, one of Shaul's most terrible kind of sins and actions is his when he wipes out Nov Ir Kohanim, this very peaceful city of Kohanim, whose only crime was giving food to David when he was a fugitive. It's interesting that Shaul wants to wipe out a whole town that wanted to feed David, and now we have David wanting to wipe out almost a whole town for doing what? Right, for not feeding him. So it's interesting also, I think this is definitely like the narrator here kind of putting in this parallel. I think it's also an interesting thing, right, when we think about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that, real self-reflection, real introspection, like sometimes when we're looking at ourselves and almost like realizing, I mean, hopefully not, but in certain cases, like sometimes like people become like what they feared, or like people say, I'm never going to be like, I remember when my first year teaching, different like assignments, like, oh, I hated doing that assignment when I was a kid, or I hated, having like when teachers would give a test like this, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh no, I'm that person, like giving that test. But like sometimes like we say, that, sometimes it's justified, but sometimes I think here, right, David is like, becoming Shaul, and he needs Abigail to kind of like, again, the importance of Abigail in this narrative, of talking him down, of being able to kind of like, show him kind of what he's become. One actually thing before I forget, I didn't mention this before, which is interesting, is actually the Gemara and the Midrash actually, because Abigail, I think, is one of the, the heroines of the story. Actually, they do take her to task for that line that she says when she's like, and remember, your handmaiden, or the pasuk was, right, where she says like, Sakarti, right, that you should, Zachartet Amatach. And they say like it was inappropriate that she was like, again, like maybe, and like different scholars talk about maybe she, was married off when she was very young to this like, jerk of a guy, and she wasn't, happy in that setup. But it was inappropriate for her while she was still married to Naval to kind of be making hints to David. To the extent that like the Gemara and the Midrash says that it actually writes Abigail there, and this is in source, I read in source 5, without a yud. Almost like as like a criticism, a little bit of Abigail. And it's interesting that a few other scholars point out that later on, Abigail was always referred to, even in Shmuel Bet, as Eshet Naval. So interesting also kind of like this idea of almost like and even like medieval Parshanim talk us a little bit like a veiled critique of David, like how we, like, especially like Kinui or different ways people are referenced, right, in the whole story of David and Bathsheba. Bathsheba is still married to Uriah, but it always references her as like Eshet Uriah, almost like, again, like this like dig at David. So here too, almost at like, and again, I think it's just interesting, to show like, Abigail, she's definitely, I think trying to save, her town, and her family, and also I think, is helping David, but like, is there a little bit of like an opportunistic like sense here? Like unclear. So it's interesting that again, like the Chazal are the ones that read into this also in Masachet Megillah, and they're not very, and even again, reading into it a much more like flirtatious or a much more kind of, like seducing that is not apparent really in the Pshat. So again, just to summarize, we spoke a lot about David's motivations. We saw different options, whether it be Abigail, trying to tell David to be his best self, like you just, this is not what you're about. We saw in the previous paragraph how you refused to kill Shaul. Don't be that person now. We saw the parallels of David and Bathsheba and this idea of kind of like the latent, or like the characteristics or character traits of David that he's able to keep in check now with Abigail's help, with the potential for adultery, the potential for murder. But again, we spoke about it's necessary for a king to have ambition, but you have to keep that power in check. And unfortunately, later on, he's not able to do that. And we also spoke about even the sense of, with David and Shaul, that later on, he has another interaction with Shaul to kind of like act as to show that he's come full circle and he's internalized Abigail's message. We spoke about his parallel to Naval, that maybe David psychologically sees Naval as Shaul, and that's why he gets so angry and he has such like a visceral reaction. And we also spoke about how David kind of becomes Shaul himself, and he's almost becoming his worst nightmare. So just to kind of like as one final idea, I want to talk a little bit about the end of the story with Naval's death. And it's interesting that, as I think when we summarized it before, right, that Abigail comes back, Pasuk Lamed Vav, Naval's really drunk, and she doesn't say anything. The next morning, she tells him everything, and it says, Vayamatz libo bekirbo, in Pasuk Lamed Zayin, like his heart like dies in his chest, V'hu haya le'even. And he turns to stone, but he's still alive. And 10 days later, he dies. So what exactly kind of is going on here? So most explanations are that Naval was like a miser, and when he finds out, when he sees a credit card bill, right, what's his reaction? He's like, what's like this crazy and heart attack, v'zeu. So it's interesting, Rav Bazak, in his book on Shmuel, actually said that's not a compelling answer. He's like, it doesn't make sense that like someone would be such a miser that would have such a visceral reaction. And he has a very different read, which I think gels nicely with the last point we made about not becoming our worst nightmare. And he says that really it wasn't the credit card bill, but it was really the idea that Naval hears from Abigail how far like the consequences his actions had. That, he, is a very difficult person. He rebuked David. It's probably not the first time that he was a jerk to someone. And he realizes he brought his entire family, his entire, land, like this close to annihilation. And almost realizing, what his actions did was too much for him, and he almost like just shut down. Which I thought was a very interesting way to see kind of like this idea and a different kind of read of it. And just to conclude, it's interesting that, very fitting that in Source 6, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah actually puts the time frame of this to the actual time frame we're in now. And it says, like, why was it 10 days, right? Vayika aseret hayamim ve'gaf Hashem et Naval, asar yamim mayav etayhu, like, why 10 days? So then it gives, like, one explanation, like 10 days, because like they actually ended up giving David's soldiers 10 meals. We're going to skip to the other answer. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Baravuha, Elu asara yamim shebin Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim. And Rashi on the next page, next source, explains like what does that mean that it was a time frame of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? She'em tin lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu she'yashuv v'lo shav. That God actually gave him 10 days to do tshuva, and he didn't do tshuva, and he died. But I think it's just like an interesting kind of tie-in and a fitting way to kind of conclude the shiur, right? That like as we find ourselves in this time period of introspection, as we find our this time period where we're trying to move to become better people, to be more self-aware, to be more self-reflective. I think there's a lot of like really powerful lessons we can take from this very, very rich parak, and both in the literary sense and the content sense of being aware of kind of what our triggers are, being aware of kind of our negative characteristics, but again being able to channel them. And I think that also, like, you can think that there's different models for tshuva. The Rambam's model is very much like you have to become a different person, right? Change your name, change who you are, to be able to say, like, I am not that person who did those former sins, and really kind of do a 360. Rav Soloveitchik, in his book on Al HaTshuva, has a very powerful, very beautiful article where he talks about, no, really there are two options. There's Bi'ur Hara, right, where you can, like, eradicate, like, the sin and really become a different person, like the Rambam, or there's Halato, you can raise it up, and you can take those characteristics and you can use it to that level of the place, right, Hamakom, where a Baal Tshuva stands, no one else can stand on that place. And I think it's an interesting thing here that, we're not saying to negate these characteristics, like they give David a lot of power and potential and charisma as a leader, but how do we channel it towards a positive place, and how do we ourselves also channel our own characteristics to places that can help us. So everyone should have a Gemara Chatzimina Tova, and I'm happy to stick around if people have questions or comments. So, okay.
I think there's another approach also that what you said, this fits into also.
Yeah.
And it's all connecting to Pesach. And
You answered it.